thanks everyone for coming today, where we're going to be looking at how you can take portfolio approaches as a way to embrace uncertainty. You may have heard the word portfolio used in many different ways. We'll unpack that for you today, and I'm really pleased to welcome Giulio today, who's almost a veteran on the kind of London Policy and Strategy Network, having shared with us previously insights on what we can learn across the world, and kind of more specifically in Asia, on how organizations are responding to the pandemic and developing creative approaches. Today he's going to talk about how we can blend kind of taking strategic approaches in an experimental way. If you've got kind of comments or questions, do throw them in the chat bar during the presentation, and we can send you the presentation afterwards as well. And then we'll have a kind of a short exercise, and then we will kind of explore together how we might use these approaches and adapt them to our own work and organizations, and that can also help us identify potential themes for future sessions as well. But without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Giulio. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Noel, and thank you again for the invitation to come. And for everybody, my name is Giulio. I work at UNDP. I'm based in Bangkok, and I head something called the Strategic Innovation Unit. So what I wanted to do today is share briefly our very brief history of embracing portfolio approaches. It's a story of why we decided to change our approach to innovation, and pursuing an approach that actually tries to embrace uncertainty rather than thinking we should reduce it. And the reason why we did it is because we are dealing with challenges like the one. We are complex, we are very difficult, we are very entangled, wicked problems, and the model of innovation we were pursuing before has served us well in terms of building organizational muscle, but was not really coherent with the nature of its complex and uncertain challenges. So how, in the context of a traditional bureaucracy, can you actually open up a possibility to embrace uncertainty? This is the road we just started on. We are very, very early days. We have many more questions than answers, and certainly we are not in any way best practice, right? So I'm opening this up in the spirit of work in progress. So Noah mentioned that we would do an exercise in the end. I thought I would invert a little bit the order. I hope you don't mind. If you are an introvert like me, you sort of hate this interactive session, so I'll keep it relatively short. But I wanted to do a small exercise with you. There you go. Sorry. And hope to get a little bit of interactivity. Don't get too worried. This might seem really, really basic, and it is basic. It's an exercise that we do with colleagues to get to prime them to start thinking about complexity and complex social systems. So anyway, so what you can see here is a classroom. And I wonder if you can tell me, just looking at the way this classroom is arranged, what kind of education do you think it provides? Anybody brave enough to give answer, offer ideas? Boring, yes. Sorry, we're saying? I saw a boring in the chat. Yeah, what else?
Instruction-based learning.
That's right, instruction-based learning, yeah. How are things arranged? What kind of message do they send? Yeah, one way, structured, rigid, formal, rote, totally, yes, exactly. So the interesting thing about this teacher is the one with the knowledge. Absolutely. Children are being taught. Yep, not the other way around. Chalk and talk. Fantastic. Absolutely. Yes, and it's just the interesting thing is that you don't really when you look at this as a system, right? You look at simply the relationship between things. You don't look at them individually. So you can just see that, for example, the fact that the teacher is standing, as you said, does not inspire creativity, right? So if you look at the relation between different things, you would see that the product, if you want, that emerges from this, an education system that has in the chat, which is interesting enough. If you were, for example, to put the chairs in a circle, what do you think would happen? Only by changing that. More collaborative, yeah. Much more inclusive and open. Yeah, greater interaction. Yeah, exactly. Simply notice that you haven't inserted anything new into this system. You simply change the relationship between things that exist already there. If you had the students standing up, right, rather than the teacher, you would have yet another type of relation. And this is without introducing anything new into here. You're simply changing the relationship between objects that already exist in here. So this is a very basic exercise. I appreciate it, but it really brings back a point when we are trying to prime, as I said, colleagues to look at the world from a system lens. And this is actually, by the way, taken by a really beautiful booklet. You have a source there if you're interested, which we use quite a lot as a reference, right? Saying that fundamentally arrangements of things in a complex system tend to get certain type of effects to emerge. And in this case, as you all have pointed out, the arrangements of a room, of the things in this system, is producing certain type of effects. The obvious question here is then, and this is what also we would ask you, is what keeps this system in this current state? Why is it difficult to change this system? And obviously, it boils down to a number of different things like culture, tradition, power relations, all sorts of assumptions about what constitutes a classroom and an education system. So for us, this is a way to prime colleagues to think about when you look into an issue, rather than looking at individual pieces, start thinking about the relationships in this system and what kind of effects this tends to generate as a result. It's also a way to start thinking, you know what, as development professionals, so we work in international development, we all think that we need to bring new solutions to a system, right? But the first thing that one might want to look here, as I said, in the case of just rearranging the chairs, by changing relations, might actually be able to produce new effects without necessarily introduce anything new, a new solution or something coming from us even, right? And obviously, what this leads us to, you probably know this sentence, I've seen it many times before, it's attributed to many different people, so I didn't put the attribution here, but if you know the source, please let me know. Right, so which is every system is perfectly designed to get the results that it gets. And this is obviously the case of education system in this case. So this was just a brief exercise, but to give you a sense of very quickly of how we are starting to really think and re-equip ourselves with instruments, and I'll show you in a moment what this looks like in reality, to start looking at issues from a system perspective, embracing the fact that in a complex system, things emerge in many ways, in unexpected ways, from the relationship within it. So back to the real world, I thought I would give you a couple of examples of the type of issues we are talking about, which actually is what led us to start thinking about portfolio approaches. So this is the city of Da Nang in Vietnam. It's a city that has predicated its economic development on a very nice stretch of beaches. It wants to become the new Bali. It has, however, a big problem, which is it has only one big landfill, which is getting filled up. And the location for a new landfill is very difficult to find. They are being proposed a number of different solutions, but like in many other cities in Southeast Asia, there is a thriving economy of informal pickers that live around the landfill, which means that when, for example, a proposition was done to close the landfill, there were quite a lot of social unrest. The landfill is seeping into the beach, threatening the very source of development of Da Nang. So as you can see, this is a classical example of a wicked problem. It's environmental, it's economic, it's social at the same time. The city has a really sophisticated resilience plan, but implementing it has proven to be quite difficult. Another example, in Bhutan, the government is very concerned, has been very concerned for the last 10 years about the issue of unemployment, has done an enormous amount of efforts to invest. Education, for example, comes for free. They rethought about their professional curriculum. They develop a number of important initiatives, and yet the problem persistently and stubbornly is there. Partially also because it has to do with a number of issues related to culture, attitudes, opportunities, markets, the very difficult geopolitics of Bhutan, etc. So what do you do when you deal with an issue like this? Well, the system is stuck, is arranged in such a way where it's difficult to see new options. Unfortunately, the development sector has a proven track record of what not to do. So I'm sure many of you might have heard about the cobra effect. This is a very well-known story in development circles. In the colonial times, the British thought that they would get rid of cobras because they were causing quite a lot of deaths. And so they, in India, they actually gave out money. They had instituted a policy. They would give money to whoever brought in dead cobras. Now, anybody of you knows what the story of what happened, or can imagine what happened? Once you give money to bring you back that cobra. I don't see any suggestions. Well, many more cobras. Yes, they start breeding cobras. Exactly, precisely. Now, as we started breeding more cobras, I started farming cobras. That's right, exactly. So you know the story, right? So basically, then, of course, they were paid too much, which means that the British changed their policy. And what happened is that actually when people released the cobras from the farms that were not useful anymore, and more people died in the end, right? So this is a classical example of plans to try to tackle an issue that go wrong. And so we know for sure that this type of approaches do not work when dealing with complex issues. What might seem on surface a very rational solution often gives you unintended consequences. In fact, you might always say that a feature of intervening in a complex system that you need to expect unexpected consequences almost by definition. So what do you do with it? You know, there is another famous example. The Australian government wanted to reduce teenager pregnancies. They gave dolls that looked like babies and cried and had bodily function to young girls to dissuade them from having kids. And the net results that actually this increased the number of pregnancies. So these are all the solutions that seem to be on surface very logical, but may not necessarily work. So back to us. How do we change it? How do we think about a different way of intervening? And for us, this has been a journey of rethinking first and foremost what is our intent, then the mindsets that we want to bring to these problems, and then the portfolio logic. So I'll take you briefly through this. So the first thing that we said, okay, so what do we want to do when dealing with complex issues like the ones I showed you from Vietnam or from Bhutan? And a general feeling that we have is that when you actually show to policymakers things like this, system maps, this is actually from Bhutan, looking at drivers of youth unemployment. The general feeling is not one of empowerment, but quite the opposite. It's quite a feeling, oh my God, this is so complex, where do I even start? So how do you actually provide a sense that there are more rather than less options? Because unfortunately, what happens is oftentimes we're dealing with these complex issues. Governments go for the plaster syndrome, right, as Cassie calls them, trying to get under lots of political pressure, quick fixes to problems that are very complex. Think about contract tracing apps in the times of COVID. Obviously, something that would seem, lots of governments latched on lots of hopes to as a quick fix, but we've seen in many places the limitation of a type of approach. So, for example, in Vietnam, in Da Nang, they are considering putting an incinerator, but they already know that the incinerator is going to drive much higher the level of pollution in the city. Or in Bhutan, they try to put a Fab Lab in cooperation with MIT. It's a great initiative, but you're not going to solve something as complex as unemployment just by having a Fab Lab. So what do you do on top of this? How do you create new options to operate? Now, one thing that we know is that in a complex system, you need to have a budget of possibilities, right? You need to create opportunities and new possibilities to act, and you need to explore them proactively. So if you haven't seen it, there is this beautiful lecture from Brian Eno and Will Wright, who's the creator of SimCity. And what he shows you there is actually the model under which SimCity was created, which model how people seek prosperity. And the general assumption was that people would seek many different strategies to basically play the game, looking at success from different angles, materials, and social. What you see on the right is actually the actual strategies that people used. And you can see that there are many possibilities that are not being explored. When you lock yourself down into this single point solution, into these things that you hope that by miracle solve a problem, technocratic solutions, you often don't see many other options that are available to you. How do you create this? And as you know, governments are trying many different ways to think about this. This is in the UAE, there is actually a Ministry of Possibility, which is a virtual ministry that is trying to bring to the bureaucracy a sense of new possibilities. And obviously in the UK, you have, as of I think a couple of weeks back, thanks to FutureGov, the Institute of Impossible Ideas, right, for local government. So these are ways to signal to institutions that there are new options to be explored. So the second thing that we know is that when we're dealing with these really complex issues, fast is not the direction, right? This is a quote from Rowan at the Institute of Public Policy. And so the way we then explain it is if you're dealing with this type of complex issues, what you want to set is the direction, right? Where is this innovation going? And the way we explain it to internally is imagine if you are a government who's advertising a job this way and say, come work with us, we will digitize our process, reduce the time to get a driving license by 30%. And imagine if the same job was advertised this way. We will redesign mobility so that we will no longer use cars, depend on fossil fuels, and provide healthier life for everyone. The first one works very much within the existing paradigm. The second one tries to create and generate a new paradigm. Obviously, the first one is easier. The second one is really much more difficult because into a radical change for the whole way you think about the issue and you structure yourself. Now, a really important concept for us has been then the idea of yes, I did a bit of an A/B testing actually in some of the presentations. It's an interesting thing. So who people tend to go to the left or to the right. It's an interesting thing also in terms of A/B testing. Anyway, thank you. One of the key concepts then, if you want to create a sense of expanding options and not lock yourself up into solutions, is that basically what we are trying to do through a portfolio approach is the opposite of a funneling. And funneling, as you know, is very popular from Silicon Valley models, accelerators, etc. And fundamentally says, you plant many seeds and you hope that out of this, at least one becomes the unicorn, and you accept that many of the other ones will die, but you hope that one scales up and becomes big. Now, not only this is proven to work not very well for social complex issues, but also it's very wasteful process, right? What if instead of designing for funneling, we design for layering? So assuming that the different interventions that we are doing are not designed to fail, but are designed to learn from each other over time, which doesn't mean that many of them will not be dropped, but they actually generate and accrue intelligence over a period of time and increase by this way the level of options available to a decision maker rather than getting them to hope that the one magic bullet will transform itself into a unicorn. So for us, this has been a fairly fundamental principle when we think about portfolio design. So I talked about the intent, right? The intent is to create more options for decision makers, and the intent is to avoid locking ourselves into technocratic single option, single point solutions that we know don't work very well for complex issues. The second challenge has been to rethink what type of mindset we want to get into. And as any good planners, we are, primed to think about defining an ideal state and then trying to work backwards from it, right? Which obviously oftentimes generates situations like this. It's not only that any strategy doesn't survive a first contact with the field, but it's also that our plans are by and large filled with assumptions, and the bureaucracies ask us to produce the perfect plan up front, and then obviously reality kicks in and we discover that the world is quite different. So the question here is, how do you move from a mindset where you need to have a perfect plan up front, which identifies 5 years in advance all possible risks and things, which obviously is impossible, to actually work from an initial set of positions, and rather than focusing in getting the perfect plan up front, you focus on getting the very superior adapting capability. So we're dealing with complex issues. We know that we need to intervene to understand how a system operates, its arrangements and its effects. How do we actually build superior adaptive capability rather than superior planning? Not that we don't need good planning, but the emphasis then becomes on how do we adapt and take decisions over time. I call this in many ways playing the infinite game. What type of mindset is this? Often, at least in the development sector, we tend to say we need to put ourselves out of business. And I find often that saying a little bit facile. First, because I haven't met many bureaucracies that are very keen on getting themselves out of business, genuinely. But then also because I think the nature of the issues that we are dealing with are much closer to a very difficult and continuous quote unquote game. Think about inequality. When can we really say that we have solved inequality, whether it is in a developing countries or in a developed country? This is something that is an ongoing struggle. It doesn't mean that we cannot get better at it. We certainly want to get better at it. But the point is that this is one of these complex issues where we need to continue adapt our processes and approaches so that we can get better and better at tackling it. And I think for us, one of the big interesting question around this has been to explore, and this is one of the principles for our portfolio approaches, right? So our normal tendency would be to go immediately into a system and go very, very extremely granular, for example, through ethnography and all these other tools to understand as much as possible about the context, which is absolutely necessary. But what we found out in our journey is that actually it helps to begin with to start asking different type of questions. This is where the exercise that we started with really came from, which is to say, can we actually ask ourselves what are the dynamics and the arrangements in a particular system, and try to, in a sense, abstract as much as possible. What you see here is an abstraction of a city as a system, to actually prime ourselves not to go bogged down into the very nitty-gritty to begin with, because what we want to do is to ask a different type of questions around the system, looking at it from a point of view of the relations between things, rather than necessarily into the nitty-gritty details to begin with. And so what happens is then in the infinite game is really developing, abstracting, going, building this mental model of an issue, going back into reality, because again, we assume that no matter what a fantastic model we have at the beginning, the complexity means that we need to get into the real world and assume that many of the things that happen there will be different, keep going back and revise our mental model, keep going back into reality and continuously adapt. This is a superior adaptive capability in terms of actually how we want to understand this space. Which means that ultimately, and this is a major mind shift for us, is we are not in the business of promoting solutions, but rather options. So if you take a portfolio logic, what you really want to think through is where are the evolutionary possibility of this system, right? Where do I go into this space to understand, to generate learning? Because it's a complex issue, because we want to spatially start thinking into this complex issue where we want to be, so that we understand its different dynamics better, and over time become better and better at learning and adapting our work accordingly. And so we call these options because it's a way to literally think about where probes that you put into a system according to a particular logic, so that your learning accrues and augments over time. Again, back to layering, meaning, as opposed to funneling. So which finally leads me to portfolios, right? So said intent is to think and provide more options to decision makers, not lock ourselves into single point solution. The mindset is one that basically says we want to adapt, become really good at adapting as we learn more about complex systems where we work with. And we acknowledge that this is an ongoing struggle. It's an infinite game, right? Of us intervening, understanding, being surprised, failing, and then adapting accordingly and continuously going there, moving from that mental abstract space into reality and back again. This allows us to keep a North Star while at the same time engaging deeply with the world. So how do we bring this all together? And this has been our journey for the last few months, is through portfolios. Now, what do we mean by portfolios? We are, generally speaking, a very project organization, which means that we tend to have a lot of projects, but to explain how is this set of projects coherent with the nature of a challenge that we're facing is quite difficult. So a general mindset, again, the general way to think about this is a portfolio is a set of connected interventions that learn from each other over time. At the moment, it's difficult for us, depending on place and location, to actually look at our existing portfolio this way. We are, different programs go their own different way, and finding the coherence among all this type of activity is a challenge. Again, for us, we are the challenge is to say, can we look at our portfolios as something which is not, given to us, or the bureaucracy creates it because we have these silos and these other things, but actually something that we proactively shape and model over time to become better and better at tackling complex issues. So what does a portfolio logic look like in our world? We basically agreed with other donors that we move from an innovation model which was based on lots of small-scale experiments into what we call deep demonstrations. So these are deep engagements on one issue in 7 countries around the world. And what we are learning, applying these portfolio logics according to the principles I showed you, is fundamentally for us at the moment, it looks that this practice consists of 4 building blocks. The first building block seems offensive almost, but we actually find that the answer to these questions is not necessarily easy always for us. So why are we working on this issue right now? And when we start asking these questions, it really brings back issues of identity and relevance. Who are we, and why is this issue relevant to us, and what can we bring to this issue? So these are typically collaborative conversations that we facilitate around intent, the objects that we are working on, and our identity. So practically, this means, for example, we are arranging country offices. We would have a conversation over a period of time that starts defining intent, redefine our identity, and establish why this particular issue is relevant to us. Then it's a question of starting thinking about the problem, and again, think about the exercise with the classroom as a bit of a primer for that. We're taking a system perspective, which basically means we tend to project our internal taxonomy into problems. So we basically say, because we have an environment program, then the government we work with has an environment issue, right? Think about Bhutan, unemployment, or the waste issue that I showed you. Those are not things that fit neatly into one department. So how do you actually look at the problem from a systemic nature rather than trying to project our internal taxonomy into it? We are exploring a number of different ways, like some of it I showed you, in terms of visual representation, right? So trying to move away from understanding problems from documents and PowerPoints and reports to actually navigate this complexity visually and try to provide questions of how do we orient ourselves in a complex system. I mentioned this thing that has been a bit of a counterintuitive journey for us into finding this balance between abstracting, so trying to simplify our understanding to basically look and understand better the fundamental dynamics within a system, and then going back into reality, going very granular to understand the ins and outs of a particular issue. The third piece in this approaches we are exploring with is then how we are going to intervene, right? And again, here for us, a big shift is from solutions to options, which basically means where do we want to be in this system, and this idea of layering meaning and learning over time as opposed to funneling. All of this would not be sufficient without, as I said, a strong mechanism for adaptation and learning. Which basically means looking at the portfolio and managing it dynamically, acknowledging that the learning will accrue over time and we need to adapt accordingly. And we call this a sense-making protocol. I'll walk you very quickly through this and then we can go through questions. So the mechanics of this, as I said, when we started looking at the issue of why are we working on this and why right now, it starts bringing on questions around, do we have a common understanding of the issue, the mental model, but also do we have a North Star? What is our intent? And intent is very different from an objective, the way that it's a direction, not a destination. It's not, we are going to reduce this by 30%. It is, what is our North Star? What is our guiding principles, if you want? What do we really want to see happening? And this is conversations that we facilitate at a different level of management and staff across a country office to really start building this common frame of why this issue matters, why it matters to us, and why it matters right now. We then move into understanding, right? The second piece of a framework that I showed you is, you can see here different attempts at we're experimenting with a number of different approaches to actually get to a system perspective on an issue. What you see on the left is a program we're doing on food, redesigning food systems in Thailand and in Pakistan after COVID. On the bottom, you see an example from a project we're doing in Serbia on depopulation. And on the top, you see something we're doing on governance in Rethinking Trust in Malawi. So what is common about these approaches is fundamentally trying to think through the constitutive elements of a complex issue, trying to build a common mental model. If you read Radical Uncertainty from John Kay, the former FT economist, the book actually talks quite a lot about why, when you're dealing with a complex issue, the most important question we should be able to answer is what is actually going on here? How do I understand this system? It's not having models or data necessarily. It's actually having a good qualitative, robust qualitative process to understand what is going on. And this is really what we are experimenting with, following a number of different approaches. I mentioned already, all right, so this is a key principle, is we want to provide a different type of options. So imagine that once you try to understand some of the system dynamics, you start going out into the world and you learn. Then you start saying, where do I want to be in this system so that I understand and I accelerate my learning about it. And which brings me back to a final piece, which is really how do we adapt and learn, right? And for us, we've sort of simplified this concept with the help of Cobra, looking at what does it actually mean to learn and adapt from an existing portfolio. So here you can see, if you have an intent, right, you do stuff, you reflect, and when you have a new intent, and because you've done something, you reframe your intent, and the difference is what you can call the learning, right? And obviously, a key piece in here is creating that loop opportunities for reflecting. And this is what the Sensemaking protocol that we developed is actually designed to do. One way of thinking about this, so this is a quiz. These are 3 different heart readings. 2 of his hearts are unhealthy and 1 is healthy. Can anybody guess through the chat which one is the healthy heart? A, B, or C? B, C, B, B, B. Yeah, most people get it right. Yeah, it's actually B. And the reason why that is that this is a heart that is agile and elastic enough to adapt to external circumstances constantly, right? Now, the problem is which one of we think is, our organization, and colleagues sometimes say A or sometimes say C. But the point about this is that the difference between a heart that does this if it's healthy automatically, right, spontaneously, and an organization, and that in an organization, the decision to change and adapt based on changing circumstances is a matter of a number of decisions that are taken across the organization, of micro patterns of behavior and decision making. And this is much more difficult to achieve. Building the institutional will to say, oh, I did that, I learned, and I do things differently tomorrow is really much more complicated than a heart if it is healthy, right? So we developed this protocol, which is a process that, again, we bring. So assuming you have, an intervention, a portfolio, which is designed with a number of options in a topic like waste or food or unemployment, then we bring a social process where people from across an office that is managing this project look at the existing options. They reflect on what are the patterns. So they don't look at necessarily the individual activities. We look at the patterns between these different activities and then start having a conversation, reflecting back on their original intent. They see these patterns and then say, okay, this is what we set to do. This is actually what is emerging from a portfolio. what are we learning and what do we need to do differently to then move into intelligence and action? How do we rearrange the portfolio to adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining our intent, our North Star? And so this is a collaborative process. It lasts a couple of days, and the way we design it, of course, it could be done differently. And it's really about the adaptive building adaptation into the management of a portfolio. These are the details if you're interested. So to wrap it up, as I said, we started from an intent, which is really to embrace complexity and recognize that we need to become much better at embracing system approaches. We worked on mindset and tried to say, can we actually move away from the idea of having the perfect plan to building much stronger adaptation capability? And then portfolios are things that we are trying in 7 different geographies around the world as a different way of understanding and then acting into the world, so that we accelerate our learning and hopefully become more impactful in the process. What that has meant really as an organization is that where we were before, which was really mostly intervening with the experiment and the pilot level, we started asking a different set of questions around the coherence of a portfolio. Policy and programming becomes the key entry point rather than experiments and pilots. And we start in much deeper questions about why are we intervening into a particular issue. Another way of looking at it, and this is really my final slide, is we are basically trying to develop a new capability, which is not only that of managing experiments, but actually designing portfolio of options as a way to actually embrace complexity and build long-term institutional will for adaptation and long-term effect. I'll stop it here. If you're interested, there is a number of blog posts and things we published on our website with some of the learning. We have an ongoing blog where we share what we are learning from what we call these deep demonstrations with 7 projects that I mentioned. And if you're interested, this is my email address. Thank you very much.
Great, many thanks for that, Juno. Wow, that was a kind of a whistle-stop tour and kind of journey through, how we can take kind of an experimental approach, but which really focuses, like you said, on kind of the North Stars that we want to mobilize around. And I think those metaphors, those analogies, the kind of are so helpful to really help us get inside those challenges. And I particularly like the kind of the heart rate one, because it does really make you think about whether our organizations are as healthy as we think they are, if kind of like the theory of our frameworks actually translates to a heartbeat which is kind of virtually stopped. So we've got we got kind of a quick reflection exercise on Jamboard, but I don't know if people have got any kind of urgent questions that they'd like to ask Julio before we do that. Let's maybe take a couple of minutes. So do put your hand up, or do put a comment in the chat bar if you do have a question. So there's one there, Julio. Can you see it in terms of the learning and cycle and curve, and then we'll come to Sunny afterwards?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, Lena. I don't know about the. I mean, I think the nuances in these things, right? So I think obviously the PDSA and what we're trying to do moves very much in the same space, right? And I certainly, we cannot say quite yet whether it's more transformative, because we are really just beginning of the journey. What I would say is that what this particular approach puts much a stronger emphasis on is the logic under which these options are developed, right? So the coherence of the design of a portfolio to the nature of a problem that you're trying to solve. And also, at least in the variants that we are exploring, this whole idea about asking different questions by, as a first instance, abstracting to a very essential elements of a system. I haven't seen much of these two things in the PDSA approach, but again, this doesn't mean that it's not there. I just don't know the ins and out of all of it to say this is actually significant difference. But in terms of being transformative, that I really cannot answer because we are just at the beginning of our journey.
Cool. We've got a hand up. Sanid, do you want to ask a question?
Yes, I would. Thanks so much for the inspiring talk. My question would be about so I don't know how much influence you as an organization have on the setup of the ways of engaging with different parties and partner organizations. But to in my setting, we are quite dependent also on the acceptance of other partners in the system to adopt let's say a new approach, and this could be regarded as a new approach. So maybe could you elaborate a little bit on what kind of challenges, or I don't know, like what that looks like in your situation, getting everybody involved in adopting a new approach?
Can you see the scars on my face? Look, there's a number of different interesting things here, right? So for a start, I think this applies to anybody trying to applying a new approach, right, in different ways. But here, what is particularly interesting, I think, for our purposes, is for a number of different reasons. Our systems drive us towards delivery and short-termism rather than long-termism and really learning, right? So we have an enormous amount of metrics for accountability. We have much thinner when it comes to the learning. So it's a very different type of it's almost like we're prototyping a different system within the existing one, right? So as you do that, of course, you're facing a number of important challenges. So a couple of things for us, right? So this also depends on how you think about organizational change. I personally have only one rule in life, which is I only work with volunteers. So I basically say, look, I know what are the things that don't work, right? I think we know them, and I think everybody in our sector is quite cognizant of things that are not working. These are the things that I think we should or could at least try to improve it. Is anybody want to work with me? So this is one part of this. But on a more serious note, there's also tactics, right? One of the really interesting things for me in this particular approach is that in our first iteration of innovation efforts, as I said, we never do implementation, right? My main job was really working with the champions and protecting them from the rest of the organization. In this new approach, because we're moving much more into the programming side and strategy, if you want, I work much more at both levels, management and champions on the front lines. And this is an interesting and delicate balance, but it's proving to generate a different type of dynamic. And again, it's a beginning, right? So we're just exploring. The other thing that I would say, I can only guess from your name, but maybe you're Scandinavian from sorry. But I'm mentioning this because we just had one of the things that we're trying to do is to show to our colleagues that actually the world outside is already thinking about this. So we just had a number, for example, of Scandinavian governments presenting to our colleagues and actually saying why we're exploring system approaches, right? So you try to create the demand from the outside in that way, right? So again, it's early days. So again, I will never claim we have any success at this point, but just these are some of the tactics that we're trying. And frankly, we're learning an awful lot of new world, right? Because it's a very different innovation model from where we started. And so it presents new challenges and new opportunities.
Yeah, would be glad to follow that journey. Thanks.
Sure.
So Julia, there's quite a few other questions. I'm conscious we have 10 minutes left. So So happy for you to pick a question that you'd like to answer. Otherwise, kind of the next question was, when you're introducing a new portfolio approach,
right?
Actually, when you've got kind of very little time or budgets, kind of what are the things that can you do to avoid spreading yourself too thinly?
Yeah, so this is a very interesting question, right? So one of my arguments has been, if you look again, this is where we are coming from as an organization, right? So it doesn't apply across the board. But I would actually, in our case, would argue that this more let a thousand flower blooms approach that we used to have before, with lots of small experiments, in the long term might be more costly than trying to actually think about the portfolio approach, right? In the sense that, but again, this depends on where you are organization. This is why I think it's very difficult. So for us, doing this lots of small scale experiments has been extremely useful to build organizational muscle, right? It generates a lot of goodwill. It's been really helpful. It's just that as we moved on organizationally, we realized that was not necessarily the most effective way to try to tackle some of these complex challenges that I showed you. So actually trying to then reorganize, or at least continue to do some experimentation, but also explore this portfolio logic, maybe that generates a different type of use of a funding, which is in the long term more effective. I cannot prove it, right? This is what we're exploring, and certainly I would not make that claim to anybody at this point in time. But I think that in the sense, trying, the portfolio is less about having much more money to try lots of different things. It's more about how you think about the logic of these interventions. And in that sense, you might even have the same number of interventions. It's just that you look at them from a different type of thing. So exactly the same budget. So again, it's difficult to give a general answer because it's very context specific, I think, to an organization where they are. We can try to make this argument now because we have this history behind us where we think we learned certain things, and now we are trying to move into this particular approach. We're also being very lucky to find funders who are willing to explore this with us. So that's also another interesting question, I guess, when you look at it from the budget perspective, is do you actually mobilize different type of monies by saying that you have a different type of logic, a different type of capability around the building of portfolios? That's a big question mark. We don't know quite yet. We have been lucky to have a support so far of our donors, but it's also something that we're going to explore and see, does this actual logic generate new funding because it brings a different logic of intervention.
Great. So we've got loads of other questions, and I'm conscious that it's 5 minutes to, and it's always good to give people 5 minutes before their next meeting. So we're gonna try and aim for that. I'll put up a link where you can share further kind of like ways that you could adapt this approach in your organization, as well as challenges that you think you might encounter and kind of what you'd like to learn more of. We're going to share the presentation and recording of this session so that you can get more into it. Thanks everyone for attending. We had a really good diverse crowd today, and thanks in particular to Giulio for your really thought-provoking presentations and some really great kind of exercises to keep our creative energies buzzing as we move into the afternoon. I'll also share a link if you're interested in future events as well, starting from one next week. So thanks everyone, thanks Giulio, and see you next time.
Thank you very much, Noel. Thanks for the invitation, and thank you everyone for attending.